Welcome back. Lecture 9. For whom the bell tolls. Tells you something right there, doesn't it? Today we're talking about wills, which means we're also talking about death. But it's okay. It's going to be okay. Death and you. Someday I'll write a book called that. How do you know when you're dead? I might write a book called that as well. How do you know when you'll die? Also could be part of the series. How do you plan for the known unknowns, right? Death is one of those things that will probably happen to all of us. And I say probably because I don't like to deal in extremes. But it seems likely that it will happen to most of us anyway. So if it's a known, what's the problem? Why don't we plan for death? Well, because we don't know when, right? That's the unknown piece of it. And that throws off the whole planning piece of it. I like this cartoon. It's a follow-up to our other one. Is there a doctor here? I'm a doctor. What's going on? He's having a heart attack. I'm a doctor in philosophy. He's going to die. But did he ever truly live? Asks the philosopher. And that's what I feel like today. Is the examined life worth living? And that's what philosophy is. Philosophy is about living the examined life. And that means like asking questions about things, right? Following the Socratic method, trying to figure out where reasons come from. Why we do what we do. Why do people think what they think? Why do we define words the way we define them? Is the examined life a good life? Or is it just frustrating and obnoxious? Is the unexamined life a good life? Where you just kind of float along, let System 1 take care of things for you so you don't have to worry about it? Is the financially sound life worth it? Absolutely not. John Donne wrote a lot about death, actually. He thought about it a lot. He wasn't embarrassed by it. This is from Holy Sonnet 10. Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou think'st thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure then from thee, much more must flow. And soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. And dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And poppy or charms can make us sleep as well. And better than thy stroke. Why swell'st thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. That's pretty cocky of you, Donne, considering you died. But you didn't live in fear of death, I don't think, either. And that is something, right? I leave this in the original language, and I want to remind you that this is not Old English. This is modern English, hence we can read it. If it was Old English, you couldn't read it. Unless you knew Old English, or German or Icelandic, maybe. So what are you leaving me when you die? What do you have for me in your will? Don't worry, I will die long before you do. Wills are key, well, maybe not long before, but likely before you. Wills are a key to planning your estate as a way to transfer property after your death, which we talked about last week. All that property ownership and transfers. Eventually, you'll probably need a will. It doesn't have to be incredibly long or complicated, but it might be. It's a way to make sure that your health gets to where it needs to be after you're gone. It's a weird picture. Post-death transfers of property. There's 4 ways to do this. One is by title, right? Which is, again, we talked about last time, titling things shows the legal ownership status of them. You can also transfer property by contracts, which are legally enforceable agreements, or they can be transferred by state law. Maybe government has its own statutes or its own sort of plan of survivorship that it divvies up your stuff if you don't tell them otherwise. But there's also a way to write a will, which I think most of us are sort of familiar with, which is a legal document describing how your assets will be distributed so you can avoid probate court, you can avoid confusion and anger, hopefully, and infighting within the family and all that, and it will be a slightly more peaceful way to transfer property. Now, how property is titled dictates how it will transfer after the owner's death. If you have joutrois, there's got to be a way to say that, right? Joint tenants of the right of survivorship. Again, we talked about that previously, but it means you both have the items titled, right, together, which means if one of you dies, the other person just owns the whole. There's also payable upon death titles, which are used if there's like a bank account or something like that. And then there's transfer on death, or TOD accounts, as I call them, which can be established to ensure that your brokerage stuff goes on to somebody else, right? Now, beyond titles, there's contracts now. So we talked about titles a lot last week, but contracts we haven't dealt with before. This is a legally enforceable agreement between multiple parties, and it can be used, to put your beneficiaries down for life insurance, for retirement plans, that kind of stuff. So, for example, let's say you have a life insurance policy. Whatever the value is, whatever that policy is worth, if it's like term life insurance, right, will be transferred to the beneficiary according to the contract. Whatever it says in the contract, this is the person who owns it, this is who's going to benefit from it, just follows that plan. There's lots of other contracts too, but that's one that you might see. If a property transfer occurs via contract, tends to be less public. Again, we can avoid probate court, which is kind of a nice thing. Depending on where you live, state law might also determine how property can be transferred, how it can be titled and all that. Again, if you can keep it out of the state's hands, it's usually smoother and less risky in a sense, right? If you're worried about where your money's going to go. The thing is, you're going to be dead, so on the one hand, who cares? On the other hand, we tend to want to take care of people in our lives, and wills can be helpful with that. Wills are these legal documents that dictate our desires for what's going to happen to our property later. Testator is the person who makes the will. Dying with a will is called dying testate. Dying without one is dying intestate. Usually anybody 18 or over can make a will, but again, you might not need to if you don't have anything or you don't love anyone. But that might change at some point in your life. A gift, as we recall, non-transferable, voluntary property transfer. Giver doesn't necessarily have to pay taxes. Receiver never has to pay taxes, etc. A bequest is a little bit different because it involves leaving property to another person after death through a will. Again, you can't take that one back either. So here's what usually goes into a will. These are the common elements. First of all, again, you should be 18 or older unless there's some exception that applies. Like, for example, if you're married and you're like 16, which also means you've got other things going on. You have to be of sound mind. Like, are any of us really of sound mind, though? I mean, let's be honest here. You must be legally competent to make decisions. That's probably a better standard. You have to state your intentions, right? Like, what do you want to do? Like, I want this house to go here, and I want this account to go here, and whatever else. It needs to be written. That's not necessarily true. Some places an oral will is fine. But really you want to take that chance? No, better to write it down. It needs to be signed. It's my fancy signature. And it needs to be witnessed by at least 2 adults who are not beneficiaries to the will. So you got to find your best friends that you're not leaving anything to. And be like, hey, can you witness me giving all my money to these other friends over here? And they're like, sure. And it must be properly executed, which means it must be signed in front of the witnesses, and you cannot be coerced to sign the will, right? Or you're going to be on a TV show. Look at that sweet signature. It says signed. Now, what's interesting about wills is that they're a real-life example of performative language, and I really love performative language because it shows us what language used to be and used to do, because it's actually doing work. It's not just describing things. So performative language is language that does the thing it's describing. These are also called performative utterances. So if you're on the job one day and you've just had enough and you say, I quit, not only are you saying like, I'm done with this place, but you're also effectively quitting, right? Like you're resigning. So I quit is both an expression of how you feel, but it's also an action. Like it's making the thing happen that you are saying is happening. I quit is a way of actually quitting, right? If you're interested in this stuff, you should look up Dale Austin, who wrote this wonderful text called How to Do Things with Words, which is probably the best title of anything ever. Here's some more examples of performative language over here. If you're getting married and you say, they say, oh, do you take this, person to be your lawfully wedded spouse, et cetera, and you say, I do, you're answering the question, but you are also doing the thing that is being asked of you, right? It's like you are saying you are marrying or agreeing to this contract, and you are marrying or agreeing to this contract at the same time. Or if you're naming something, right? Like I dub the, Sir James. It's like you're doing the thing that you say you're doing. Or I declare bankruptcy. It's kind of similar, except it doesn't legally declare bankruptcy, right? But it's the same idea. You're doing the thing that you're saying. And again, like this is what language used to do. Language used to be this like living, active thing. Now we just live in a world of metaphors where everything is referring to something else, which refers to something else and something else. And it's all, turtles all the way down, right? Like where's the foundational stuff underneath? Like when did words used to mean something? And this is it, performative language, right? That's when words used to do the actions that they were describing. So whenever these things pop up, I get really excited. So I'm like, ooh, old words, old meanings are coming back. At any rate, a will is an example of this because a will is doing the thing it's saying. It's like the will is giving away the stuff that you're saying you're giving away. Now, a will is a legal document, but it's not all legally binding. So if your friend Edgar over here bequeaths you his pet raven, you don't have to take it, right? You can just claim it and say, I don't want the raven. Nevermore. If property is disclaimed, it goes back to Eddie's estate, and then it goes to probate court if nobody else is, signed up to take Edgar. So if you want somebody to take care of your pets after you die, you should probably talk to them about it first. Edgar could have planned ahead for this and written a residual clause in his will, and it would say, this is what's going to happen if my raven is disclaimed. When you're talking about estates, you're talking about somebody's property, right? It could be their personal property, their real estate, intangible assets, right? Like their brand or something. Right? What is your brand worth? Mine is worthless. Who's going to inherit your browsing history? Ooh, that's a good question. One of your Choose Your Own Adventures this term actually deals with what's going to happen to your digital legacy after you pass. So if you're interested in questions like that, what's going to happen to your online presence, your social media, check out that Choose Your Own Adventure. Wills, as we know, are somewhat flexible, but you can't just do anything with them, right? I can't say, oh, sorry, hun, there's nothing in the will for you. Sorry, babe. No. The court's going to challenge that and say you can't just not give your spouse all of your stuff if you die, or at least like a good chunk of your stuff. You give it all to your secret lover, that's probably not going to hold up in court, right? Spouse is probably going to inherit your stuff. Love you, babe. Personal representative. I do love her. Okay, I do. Just have like a jokey relationship. I can't deal with real things, so I joke about things. Personal representative. An important element of any will is the executor, right? The person who comes in and makes sure that you're dead before. The executor, the person who is your representative, right? So this could be a person or it could be an institution like a bank or something, and it carries out the will, the directions of the will, right? And disposes of the property of the deceased. It doesn't dispose of the deceased, though. If the deceased doesn't name an executor, the state will find one for you. One will be appointed for you. Do you think they're going to have your best interests in mind? I don't know. I hope so, but maybe not. Possibly. They don't know me, so that might be kind of difficult. Often they'll name an attorney, though, and attorneys tend to charge money for their services because, they're worth it. And that money is going to get charged to your estate. So your estate might shrink if there's a lawyer who's billing your estate after you're dead. So maybe if you have a friend who wants to do this, make them do it. Say, I'll do it for you if you die first. Probate. Recall that probate is a public process. So if you want everything to be sort of spilled out before society and divvied up again by some random judge, that's fine, but most people don't want that. The executor named in the will work with the probate court to validate the will. I kind of mentioned these before, but estate taxes only hit you federally if you're over 11.5 million bucks, if that's what your state's worth. Or in Oregon, if your state is worth $1 million or more, they're taxed in Oregon if you own taxable or real estate, taxable property or real estate in Oregon. So, yay, Oregon. If you want to protest a will or contest a will, you need to show that it's invalid in some way. Like, for example, if you are the spouse and you're not named in the will for some reason, you could probably contest that and say, they can't suddenly disinherit me if I spend my life with this person, right? But other reasons you could contest it, you could say, well, this person was not in a rational state of mind when they drew up the will, right? Or maybe they were being coerced into making the will a certain way. There was undue pressure from somebody. Maybe it's not being executed correctly, like they're not following the instructions in the will. Or maybe the probate court sees it and just says, no, this is not legal, can't inherit or disinherit this way. If the will is forged or fake, then yeah, obviously you can contest that. Or if the heirs were somehow engaged in fraudulent actions when it was drafted up, which is interesting too, because you wonder how far that goes. It's like if you are, convicted of a crime, are you suddenly no longer going to be able to inherit money? It seemed a little bit odd to me. Or if the will is actually like incorrect or makes mistakes. So how do you do it correctly? Well, you can pay someone, or you can not pay someone because it does cost money, and I don't like spending money on anything. You can also do this online. You don't necessarily have to talk to an attorney, right? There's online forms. You can make your own statutory will. That's a lot cheaper, a lot easier, I think, honestly. Now, if you have a very complicated estate or situation, you should talk to a lawyer because you don't want to leave things out there like question marks and stuff. But if you're pretty sure you don't actually have that much, or that your will is pretty simple, or your situation is not that complex, doing one online is probably going to be okay. Now, a lot of states actually accept legal written wills wherever they come from. So they don't have to go to an attorney, and you don't have to use some online form either. You can write your own will. It just has to have all the stuff it's supposed to have, and it needs to be witnessed and signed and properly, executed. About half of states will accept a handwritten will, oddly enough, or holographic will, even if it has not been witnessed. So if you're at the last minute like, oh, I put this off too long and I know I'm dying, you can write something out, but it's not necessarily in your best interest to do that, and it's probably not in your best interest to wait until you're dying to write a will anyway. In Oregon, these holographic wills are valid, but they actually do have to be witnessed. So if you can get Obi-Wan over here to witness it, you'll be in good shape. There needs to be certain provisions in a will, right? There's an introductory clause which says, where do you live? This is the last will and testament. Then you talk about the assets, right? And this could be really long, depending on how many assets you have and how you want them divided up. Or it could be really short and simple, depending on how you do it. Then you have to state, if there's taxes to be paid or debts to be paid, how are they going to come out of the will? And then the executor or the personal rep should be listed in there, right? It's this person and what they're going to do. If you have minors in your life, like minor children, you should probably name a guardian for them, right? Like who's going to get them after you die? Because you really don't want relatives to fight over them. You really don't want the state to send them into foster care or decide that they should live with somebody that you really don't want them to live with within your family or whatever. So don't leave it to chance, right? If you got kids, if you have assets, make a will. If you have no kids or assets, you might not need one. If you're single and you do have assets, but you want them just to go to your parents, then you're probably okay. Because if you check over here, the standard order of survivorship, and this doesn't even apply to everything, but this is basically typically what happens. If you were to die intestate, sounds dirty, doesn't it? And it goes to probate court says, okay, well, we'll just give your stuff to your spouse. And if you don't have a spouse, they're like, okay, well, we'll give it to your kids. And if you don't have kids, they say, okay, well, then it goes to your parents. And if you don't have parents, they're like, we're just going to take this, right? If you have assets and a spouse and you want your stuff just to go to your spouse, honestly, you could probably go to probate court and it would still go to your spouse. But again, like you want to take these risks, not necessarily. So who needs a will? Well, If you're somebody that does have assets and you want them to go to a specific person or organization, you want to make choices about that, then you need a will. If you're married, you should probably be safe and get a will. Make sure your spouse doesn't have to wait around for months to try to get some money back so this person can pay expenses. If you want to reduce financial confusion among your survivors, you probably need a will. If you have kids, you need a will. So what do you do with a will? Once you have written and executed a legal will, first of all, let your executor, I always want to say executor, or like execute, like the Pokemon or something. Let your executor know where the will is located. So don't bury it on an island. Keep an original document, somewhere safe. Keep a copy of it somewhere accessible. It's really easy to make copies these days. Like we live in a world that's all copies, so not real hard to do that. It's just make sure you don't lose the real one is all they're saying here. Keep it in a fireproof place. Keep it in a safe deposit box if you wanted to. Just make sure whoever needs to access that has access to that. And then write a letter of last instructions. This is not legally binding. This is not the will itself, but it can tell people what you want, right? Like, oh, just a heads up, I don't want to be buried, blah, 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 blah. Or, hey, just so you know, you can donate my organs. It's on my license, but you can still donate them. Or, hey, please remember to feed my cat or my raven, stuff like that. You should make a new will if you get married, if you have a child, if your financial circumstances significantly change, if you get divorced, if your spouse dies, if you get a whole bunch of insurance from one of these events or something else. All right, now we get to the fun part, planning for your death. Sorry. Why is it hard to plan for the end? Well, it's because your future self is far away and your dead self is like even further, right? We don't want to deal with that guy. But it's not just time, not just that kind of distance that makes it tough to deal with death. It's also the terror of the whole thing, right? Like it's horrifying to think about our own death. And if it's not, then that's also terrifying, right? Research shows that when individuals face their own mortality, we get panicky, we get freaked out. And panic and freaking out, those are system 1 problems, aren't they? That's not system 2 having a measured response like, yes, I should be terribly afraid of death. It's system 1 saying, whoa, death? What? No, don't want to deal with that. Consciously or not, we reach out for things that are safe, which usually means, again, we avoid the real problem and we look for coping mechanisms, right? This reaches all the way back to 411. We face fear, we face rejection, face terrifying things, we try to escape. We don't usually deal with them. So if I'm thinking about death, I'm not necessarily like, yeah, I am going to die someday. Let me write up a will. I'm like, I'm going to die? No, I'm not. I'm going to eat ice cream and watch TV. That's why back when Homeland Security used to put out these charts of like, oh, what is the risk of terrorist attacks today? It was like, they are terrifying me, right? Like seeing these charts is terrifying me. How am I supposed to manage terror in a scenario like that where I'm constantly reminded that death is just around the corner? Okay, speaking of that, how happy are you right now? How do painful things, like even painful things to think about, like death, how does that change our happiness? Well, Kahneman and his buddy Ritelmeyer, early in the 1990s, experimented with patients and decided, and took a look at how they rated their experience of pain during colonoscopies. So a little bit of info here. Colonoscopies did not used to come with anesthetic. What kind of barbarians used to practice medicine? That's all I want to know. They didn't used to give you an anesthetic or an amnesiac. You were awake and enjoying yourself the whole time. That's like the worst thing I've ever read. The shortest procedure was 4 minutes long among the ones that they looked at. Okay, so they looked at a bunch of patients. One of them, in and out 4 minutes. Wow, probably a short colon, right? The longest was 69 minutes, which, nice. So here's 2 patients here. Which of these patients do you think reported the most pain? So here's our short time, wonder. And then here's our longer term Larry over here, okay? Who do you think had more pain? This person who had, higher peaks of pain, but it ended relatively quickly, or this person that had pain over a much longer period of time? What do you think? Probably the blue one, right? Well, not necessarily. Pain is temporary, usually. It turned out they found two things when they looked at this experiment, right? They found something called peak end rule, and that means that looking back, having that retrospective pain rating, was predicted by the average level of pain at the worst moment and at the end. So if we look back at this chart, you can say, oh, the red one over here, the worst moment was near the end, so that average is probably pretty close. This blue one, the worst moment was sort of earlier, and then the end was a lot lower. Okay, so we average those things out. And then there's also this other thing they found called duration neglect. And that means that the length of the procedure had no effect on the total pain rating. So you might think the blue one down here would have had the worst pain because it's more over time. That's not what they reported. They reported having less pain because the average and the average between the peak and the ending was much lower. So they didn't care that it was over a longer period of time. And the red one, on the other hand, the highest pain point was very close to the end, so there's a high average there. They felt more pain. Isn't that weird? The time didn't matter, right? So it turns out that having a lot of pain over time is not somehow worse to us than having a more intense pain for a shorter period of time. Happiness means ending on a good note, not ending on a bad note like the red one did here, even though it was quick. So if life is about minimizing pain, or is it about limiting the memory of pain? How do we do that? Is it not about those things? I don't know. Survey time. How much money would you pay for an extra year of life? $1,000? $10,000? $100,000? $1 million? Would you commit fully to a plant-based diet? Which of these things is the right answer? It's probably the last one on there, sadly. But how much would you pay? Like, how much of your actual money would you pay to live an extra year of your life? 10 grand? Maybe. Still got to pay to live. Life is a story, in a sense. And it's a story that we want to end well because endings matter to us. How we feel at the end of something is what we remember. So Ed Diner took a look at that, those colonoscopies, right? And he studied duration neglect and the peak end rules. And he wanted to assess how that affects how we look at our own happiness in our lives. And he found out if you double the duration of someone's life, in these experiments they were looking at, it had no impact on total life happiness. So kind of like in those colonoscopies, it didn't matter how long it was. It doesn't feel more painful if it's a long period of time. Similarly to our lives, like longer period of total happiness, they're not connected, right? The longer period does not impact the total happiness. You can have a very happy life in 5 years, and you can have a really sad life in 50 years. Happiness is not the total of everything we do in our lives. It's something else. It has something to do with like moments in our life that we remember that stand out to us. So what's your future self going to remember about this year? What's your future self going to remember about next year? How do you know if a vacation was good? Do you go back and look at the photographs and see, does it look like I was having a good time? Was I frowning in these photographs? We tend to evaluate our vacations and our time off based on the stories and memories we get from them. So if we have a lot of these photographs, a lot of memories, a lot of times that we were, jumping in the pool or something, we might feel like, oh, that was a great vacation. So Diner looked at this step too, and he found out that memory tells us whether we want to repeat an experience or not. It kind of makes sense that you remember things and you say, well, do I want to do that or not based on the memory? So I want you to think about this for your next vacation, which you have all earned and deserve a vacation someday. Let's say that at the end of your vacation, everything, every picture you took, every memory, you wrote down about that is deleted, disappears, can't get it back. And all your memories of that trip are also deleted, disappear, gone forever. How would knowing that change your vacation plans? How much money are you going to pay to go on this trip that you're not going to remember? Oh, that's a challenge, isn't it? And because it's a challenge, you realize, oh yeah, a big part of vacation is remembering the vacation, right? Like a big part of good times is remembering good times. Like that's the interesting thing about nostalgia is we think like, oh, I would love to go back to that time. I want to feel like that again. But you can't and you wouldn't and it would be different. It's like the thought of going back is the pleasure, right? Not going back. It's like being able to remember a vacation is actually the joy of the vacation, it turns out, not the vacation itself. Because if you couldn't remember any of it, would you pay a lot of money to go on that trip? I don't think so, right? The elimination of memory reduces the value of an experience for us. Which brings up a lot of other questions, right? What things won't we do if it's not memorable? Like if you had to go in and do a painful surgery and you would be conscious for that, and like you would feel the pain, but your memory would be wiped at the end. Would you do it? Would you be willing to do it? I mean, in a sense, yes, you would experience pain during the time, but then you would never experience that pain again because you would never remember that pain. Which brings up this bigger philosophical question that I don't even have an answer for, right? Like, are we our remembering selves? Are we the selves that remember what we've done, or are we the suffering selves, right? Are we the selves that experience things, or are we the selves that remember things? And based on all this data, I would say we are the selves that remember things, aren't we? Our experiencing selves do the living. They feel the pain. They feel the immediate pleasure of things. But that's not the person we live in, is it? We live in this other person that's always looking back at these things. So maybe, after all, the call's been coming from inside the house. Maybe this whole year, we've already been our future selves. Oh gosh. We're living in a mystery, folks. Living wills and powers of attorney. A slightly less interesting mystery. Your life can change in an instant. I think mine just did, right? This whole memory thing. I gotta sit on that for a while. Who am I? If you want to be prepared, you might want a living will. A living will is also called an advance directive. It's a legal document to direct a physician or hospital or other caregivers about what kind of medical treatment you want in case you are to become incapacitated. So you cannot give your wishes. What do you want to have happen? You can talk about whether you want your life artificially prolonged, like whether you want to be, perpetually on breathing machines and all that kind of stuff. Which I think now we say no, but at the time we might feel different. Who knows, right? Or maybe we say yes now and later we'd want to say no. Another mystery. Without a living will, these things are left up to courts. And we've seen what happens with that in the public, and it's usually an awful process and really not worth it. Courts tend to not want to pull the plug on you. So if you're concerned about that, you should make a living will. They're in effect if somebody 18 or older is diagnosed as being in a persistent comatose condition or persistent vegetative state, which basically means you cannot function without artificial interventions, right? Like if you're not being given food and air and all that, you would die. Like these are the situations where living wills kick in and say, do you want to continue to have your life support, or do you want us to pull the plug? Physicians have to certify that the patient has no reasonable chance to improve and that death would be the natural result of their condition, right? They can't just say, oh, you've been in the hospital while you're racking up some big bills, right? They have to show that there's no way you can come back from this. And this is what, the living will kicks in for, is to say, well, on behalf of the person who can no longer speak, I'll speak for them. So like we talked about, it's unpleasant to talk about things like this and think about things like this. It's easy to put off these conversations, especially with people that you love and care about, and with yourself, because that is a person that you love and care about, hopefully. But the stress and expense and legal hassle of trying to help a loved one who cannot communicate is going to be worse than having a living will, I guarantee you. Possible life-sustaining interventions could be things like this. Like you could say, oh, I want to be allowed to have, water or pain meds, but nothing else. Or you could say, I only want to have food, or I won't have any support, no breathing support, anything like that. The courts want you to decide this, right? They really don't want to be playing God and saying, yes, that person has lived a good life. They're done, right? They want you to make these decisions. A valid living will usually has to be 18 or older to make one of these things. It has to be witnessed by somebody not related to you. And it needs to be witnessed by people who are not going to benefit from your death in some way, right? Although there's probably TV shows about that. Witness cannot be someone who's also paying your medical expenses, and it also cannot be your doctor. So all of these are an attempt to avoid any conflicts of interest, right? You don't want someone to benefit from your death and thus push you closer towards it. You don't actually need an attorney to write a living will. In fact, every time I go to the doctor, they pretty much hand me one of these forms. One of these days, I should probably fill it out, right? You'll often need to complete one before surgery. If you're in Oregon, you can actually click on this link, which means you got to open up these slides directly, right? But they give you a nice explanation of all this stuff, what an advance directive looks like, what it's useful for, and what a living will looks like as well. So helpful documents if you're interested in drawing this up for yourself sometime soon, which I would recommend, because when are you ever going to want to do this? Never, right? So do it before you need to. Other potential medical support could be the guise of a healthcare proxy, in the form of a healthcare proxy, let's say that. Less nefarious. If you're injured, but you don't suffer from a life-ending condition, good. Like if a building falls on you and you're unconscious, but you're not, you're likely to come back at some point. Somebody can be designated your healthcare proxy, and they're the one that can help make care decisions, right? They're also called your power of attorney for healthcare. You do need to plan ahead for this, and this person is not allowed to make life-ending decisions. So this person cannot pull the plug. They can talk about conditions, meant to keep you alive, but they can't end your life or decide that. You also can put out a do not resuscitate declaration. So that means if you are terminally ill but still able to make competent medical decisions, you can draft a DNR declaration telling doctors to withhold CPR and other sort of life-saving measures. So if you're going to die anyway, effectively, you can say, don't bring me back in between. It's always voluntary, can't be coerced into this. It's a decision you have to make for yourself, right? They're not easy decisions to make either, but it's better to make them for yourself than to have somebody random trying to make these for you. Power of attorney is a legal document, has you name a person or agent to act on your behalf in whatever capacity. You may need to establish this at some point in your life, especially as you get older. Now, there's different types of POs. We already talked about power of attorney for healthcare. There's that one. There's a limited POA. It's somebody, like the POA for healthcare, where they can only act on your behalf for a certain amount of time or certain scenarios, right? So maybe if, for example, if you're going on a long trip out of the country, you need somebody to handle your bills or manage your real estate or something like that while you're gone, you could give them a limited POA while you're out of the country. A general POA is much broader, right? So anything that's non-medical, they could probably make a decision for on your behalf. So if we need to grant the Supreme Chancellor, great powers, we probably give him a general POA. Both a limited and a general POA automatically end when their purpose is fulfilled, right? So they don't just go on forever. Or if you become disabled or incapacitated, then they end as well, so that you'd have to probably take on a new person at that point. There's also durable POA, power of attorney, which remains in effect for whatever duration you spell out. So it's a time-based one. Even if you become disabled or incapacitated during that time, it still continues for the time that you've set it up for. A springing POA doesn't happen until something triggers it and then kicks into gear, right? It springs into action. It's a very exciting POA. So that if something does occur over time, somebody has the reins to help you deal with it. IRS has their own form for this too. So if you want to set this up, you can do that. Check out the irs.gov. Different reasons you might want a power of attorney. One would be allowing an attorney or accountant or enrolled agent or somebody else to work with the IRS on your behalf. So not always fun to talk to the IRS. Can be like wrestling a lion. It can also be a way to allow financial advisors to manage your portfolio and make investment decisions on your behalf without you having to be constantly consulted. and go back and forth on that. It might use a POA to help somebody who is temporarily injured. But yes, it's another example of a taboo IRS agent, not somebody you want to tangle with alone. Now thinking back again to what makes us happy, right? What's a good life? What are our life goals? If at the end of our lives, we might not even be able to recall all of the stuff that made us happy, then maybe there's a different goal to life, right? Like if I forget my vacations, was there a point to taking vacations, right? If there were times when I was suffering, but I don't remember them, was there a point to that suffering? It's like this whole memory piece, the idea that maybe we've been our future selves all along, really throws us for a loop, doesn't it? This is like the big reveal day, right? We've been building up to this all year. Suddenly the mask is off and it's like, oh, future self says, come join me in the future. And you say, no, you killed my father. And future self says, no, I'm your dad. And you say, what? That's not true. That's impossible. It says, no, search your feelings. You know it to be true. And you say, nah, but you know later he is. Actually, you are the future self. So maybe there's a different goal to life than just happiness. Here's what your life could look like. There's a happiness graph. It's based on marriage. So they studied people that got married, and they looked at how happy they were about 5 years before marriage and how happy they were 5 years after marriage. And you notice when they got married, there's this bump because you're happy, you got married, things worked out, you found your soulmate. And then what happens afterwards? Oh, you go back down to where you were beforehand. Your life satisfaction matches from beginning to end. It's not a knock on marriage. It just says, like, we don't live at our peaks, right? We live at our norms. Some of this has to do with effective forecasting. It's something that Daniel Gilbert, Timothy Wilson looked into, and it's another cognitive bias, right? Effective forecasting, where we predict our future selves' emotional states badly. That's the effective piece, right? Effective means emotional. Forecasting means looking at the future. So we badly predict our future selves' emotions. When we get married, we think marriage is going to make us happier. And we don't think we're ever going to get divorced because of how happy we are. But that graph shows you that life satisfaction goes back to your pre-marriage moments, and it can even sink further than that. Because eventually, you don't even think about marriage anymore, right? It's become a background of your life, and you're just humming along, doing your own thing, having your ups and downs. Right? We've lost that sort of comparison quality that we had before. Once it's familiar and not noticeable, marriage doesn't seem to have any impact on our happiness. Does that mean you shouldn't get married? Not necessarily. It just means that maybe you don't get married to be happy. It sounds bad even to say it out loud, doesn't it? But maybe marriage is not just about happiness. Because if it is, there's no point in getting married because you're just going to be back to normal again afterwards. Do kids make you happy? Maybe, sometimes. There's some peaks in there. But if I don't remember them, do they exist? What helps though? Well, goals can actually help. They can make a big difference in life satisfaction, even if happiness doesn't do that. One study that looked at 12,000 people found that those people who had, big financial aspirations at, the end of their teenage years, 17, 18 years old, if they stated those things, they found out that 19 years later, many of those who had aspired to having a high income had stated that was a goal for them, had actually achieved that goal. And the importance of that goal to those students at 18 years old matched how they felt about it 19 years later. So that's interesting, because it means that teens' goals influence what happens in their lives, right? And you might think like, oh, what I thought I wanted to be at age X doesn't impact who I am now, but it's not really true, right? It has to do with where they end up and what they consider to be success and how satisfied they are with their life, because they matched up that present self with their future self. So goals are kind of important to us, right? They show us how to feel about the future. Not tricks, they're illusions, Michael. Another illusion that we sort of have to navigate is this idea of the focusing illusion. Nothing is as important as you think it is when you are thinking about it. It goes back to the idea of like when intrusive thoughts show up in our heads, it's really hard for us to say this is fake. this is not real. This is not something I need to think about. Instead, we just fixate on it and say, this must be real because I'm thinking about it. What we focus on feels most important. And that makes sense because that's how System 1 functions, right? It says what I see is all there is. So it gives way too much weight to the things that are there, and it ignores all the other stuff that's actually real out there. For example, does your car make you happy? Not always. Sometimes. Usually we ignore our car and we just use it. However, thinking about it makes us overvalue it. Be like, yeah, I really like having that car. But when we ask a question like that, does your car make you happy? System 1 says, I don't know what that means, so I'm going to ask another question, which is, how much do I like my car when I'm thinking about it? And when I'm thinking about it right now, I like it. When it's broken, I hate it, right? So it's not so much about does it make us happy, it's about how do I feel right now already about it. Kahneman's question is a provocative one. He asks, are paraplegics angry all the time? That's a really loaded question, isn't it? It's probably an unfair question. But the answer's got to be no, right? It's like the marriage graph. Are married people angry all the time? No. Are they happy all the time? No. Because after a while, marriage has no impact on their life satisfaction. So paraplegics, by extension, after a while, being paraplegic shouldn't have as much impact on your life satisfaction, right? Are Californians happy all the time? I mean, they have sun, right? No, because at some point the sun has no impact on their happiness levels. But we think that. We think Californians are happy, and we think paraplegics are bummed about it, right? And it's like, well, actually people are more complicated than that, right? Turns out everybody's a little more complicated. Gilbert and Watson labeled something miswanting, which is this idea that we find bad choices or we make bad choices that are based on these errors of that future emotional forecasting, right? I guess badly about what my future self needs, and so I make terrible choices as a result of that. And that seems true, right? The focusing illusion is basically a source of miswanting. It makes us exaggerate what we actually need based on what I'm thinking about right now. So if I'm focusing right now on how my car is broken down, I might exaggerate how much, how important that car is and how much my future self is going to be upset about this scenario and all that. So what's interesting is it means a lot of the things that we buy and do are maybe not actually good for us. And maybe they're not doing anything for us. And they're not making us happier. And at some point, we're just going to go back to the way we were before. And thinking about making a will and stuff, it's the same thing. Oh, I'm going to get depressed if I think about death. It's like, yeah, but then on the other side, you're not going to care at all, right? Like there's a point at which things are no longer affecting us. Like the past is not good or bad to us. It's just the past, and we're in the present. So if we do everything based on what seems important right now, we're going to screw up a few things, right? Like if you could buy a car or you could join a book club, well, after a while, you're going to not even notice the car, and you're going to get mad at the car when it breaks. But you might always get something out of this book club and going there and seeing people and talking about something that's interesting to you, right? So happiness is not that simple. And it's not really about things, actually. It's definitely not a simple thing. Here's more of John Donne from Meditation 17. Here's a drawing of him in his shroud. He was not dead when this was drawn. He wanted to be drawn in his shroud as he would look when he was dead. Donne didn't fear death. I would hesitate to say he embraced it, but he definitely visualized it. Here's our book club. Perchance he for whom this bell tolls may be so ill as that he knows not it tolls for him. And perchance I may think myself so much better than I am, as that they who are about me and see my state may have caused it to toll for me, and I know not that. No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manner of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls for thee. I think that rings a lot more true after pandemic. Final thoughts. Don't fear your end-of-life problems. Embrace them. Wait, no. Don't put off planning for death too long. Wait. Get busy about dying so you can keep up. No. Never. Good luck out there. This stuff's hard. But you know what? You can do it. See you next week.